Space Funeral, a short adventure game from 2010, when making experimental weird RPG Maker games wasn't quite a big trend. In fact, majority of the games that are now considered RPG Maker horror classics will only come out a couple of years after. But why did this seemingly strange and chaotic game manage to gain such positive reception from the community over the years? If you just finished Space Funeral and confused what's so amazing about it, or liked it but maybe missed out on some themes and concepts, I'd like to summarize what I personally found fascinating about it, while also acknowledging game's shortcomings. But before we begin, if you somehow stumbled upon this video before playing Space Funeral, you should know that there are going to be spoilers. The game is free and quite short, perhaps you'd like to try it out first. Before discussing the themes and ideas presented in the game, let's briefly talk about what we get on the surface. Upon beginning the game, you are greeted with grotesque visuals, but the eeriness gets diminished almost right away as you talk with the NPCs. Game sprites are quite odd, sometimes uncanny, and sometimes look like they were placed disorderly on purpose. The visuals of the game are partially inspired by 1989 NES game Monster Party. I'm going to talk about it later, so know that there are going to be spoilers for it too. Space Funeral sets the humorous tone in the first few minutes of playing. Throughout the game you get lots of witty, ironic jokes and pop culture references. Gameplay is quite fast-paced, but overall I would say it's pretty ordinary for the genre. You walk from place to advance towards the final boss, fighting different enemies and occasionally having a choice to complete some side quests. Speaking of fighting enemies, combat in this game is insanely easy. Respawning enemies, lots of utility items and spare money do not help. Combat is probably the weakest aspect of the game for me. I think it serves mostly as an exhibition of characters' art and a way to make a joke or two. You don't have much need or even a room to use a big chunk of spells and items. The only thing that keeps combat from being completely underwhelming is the mystery option that provides occasional comic relief and unique enemy interactions. So, with all of that said, what exactly sets Space Funeral apart from your average RPG Maker adventure game? It's the writing and how the game sprites tie in with it. Let me explain. First, we need to understand in what kind of environment Space Funeral came out. Year 2010, when indie game scene was gaining more and more relevance and approval from the mainstream audience. With each relatively big release, people started noticing that not only you can have lots of fun with lower budget games, but that you can also try making one yourself. And while you could consider RPG Maker games to be a part of the same game category, there was one issue. Since RPG Maker programs are somewhat simple to use, over the years different developers released many different games, a decent chunk of which were not only uninspiring and sometimes very similar visually and story-wise to each other, but also just overall not very high quality. This, fairly or unfairly, created somewhat of a stigma around RPG Maker games for some people. When hearing the name of the engine emerged thoughts of yet another cheesy and buggy medieval adventure game. Right in the midst of all of this, Space Funeral was being released. And what exactly did it represent? I think it's no secret, and what probably most of the people who finished the game have picked up on is that it was a subtle critique of many of those kind of bland and refined RPG Maker games. From the preset RPG Maker music playing in the menu to the very ending sequence showing another unoriginal set of game sprites, game pokes fun at the RPG Maker tropes. Snarky remarks, dark humor, sometimes over-exaggerated cartoony behavior, and generally very unusual atmosphere for the RPG genre make the game feel fresh and showcase how over-the-top and comically plain the writing in these games was sometimes getting. Silly conversations with only one option to respond with being available also reminded me how trivial some of the dialogues in these games were, especially with side characters. But that definitely can be said about conversation with the final boss. The artist Moon reveals to us that the reason the Space Funeral world is turned into what it is now is that Moon seen how perfect everything in the City of Forms was, and that nothing could be possibly created that wouldn't be a mockery of the objects in the city, decided to corrupt it along with the entire world. This dialogue pretty much explicitly explains one of the main messages of the game, simultaneously interrelating the choice of weird visuals to the plot and themes. And the message is to ask a question: will there be a place for artists at all after every single idea in art has been tried and perfected? Maybe even hinting at the video game industry a little, implying that the overwhelming majority of the time, for a game to have some kind of attention from consumers, it has to be very complex in most of its aspects, which is only possible if it's worked on by a lot of people in a big company, and that it's very hard for a single person to create an outstanding video game in such environment. But obviously the question can be applied to any art form. It's just that the Path to Moon kind of reminded me of Debug Room with all the game characters put in one place. Also, one very cool concept that people usually overlook after finishing Space Funeral is that when Moon corrupts the world, not only the visuals become weird, become a grotesque mimic of their former self, but you could say that the game itself kind of become corrupted. The plot, the names, the fight sequences, the dialogues, while all reminiscent of regular RPG game, feel partially corrupted, mocking what they used to be before, without inhabitants of Space Funeral world even noticing it. The menu screen also reinforces this sort of meta concept. It's still a menu, but an odd one. Another interesting thing is that overall game can hardly be considered scary, but personally, even after playing a decent amount of RPG Maker games that could be described as horror or experimental, Blood Cavern section, with both of its soundtracks and later dialogue, definitely creates one of the most disturbing atmospheres I've seen in this niche. This showcases that the creator is definitely capable of working in the genre of horror and the potential for Space Funeral to be a serious scary game, but that it just simply wasn't the intention for the project as a whole. So after that, we continue on our bizarre journey. Now I'd like to talk about a slightly less obvious concept of the game that is probably more of a subjective interpretation, but nonetheless fascinating to me. The most interesting part of Space Funeral for me was that while playing the game I noticed one thing. That characters, items, places, and all their names were absolutely insignificant as long as they fulfilled their roles in the overarching narrative. And here's what I mean by that. It doesn't matter what kind of game sprites surround you, whether it's tables with faces or houses shaped like head, as long as they create a populated area environment. It doesn't matter what kind of NPCs you're meeting throughout the journey, like Wise Muscle or a wolf, as long as they tell you the lines you're supposed to hear. It doesn't even matter what enemies you are fighting, like Spooky Arm or Boomdogs, if they are there to make the game more challenging. All that matters is that every single game element, RPG in this case, is there and serves its purpose, but what form do these elements take is inconsequential. As long as the themes of creative struggles and satire on generic RPG Maker games are getting delivered, it doesn't even matter what the main character looks like, as it can be easily turned into a fish. Right from the menu screen, game just disregards RPG Maker conventions by picking same word blood for each option, implying that it should be obvious what each of them mean and that the label is unimportant for the object to accomplish its intended goal. That's what, in my opinion, really makes Space Funeral an extraordinary game. You could pick your own set of sprites and names for each element in the game, and a lot of the times it would probably work. But for having ground sharks and occasional tusks sticking out from the ground, the game does not dissolve into complete absurd. A lot of item names, for example, are still reminiscent of item names in regular role-playing games, but occasional pop culture references and generally weird picks for the labels remind the player that they are non-essential. Big areas are not completely random either, rather just another jab at the generic environments of low-effort RPGs. But the general atmosphere of the game, strange game sprites and what NPCs say ultimately make them silly and unimportant. And the final boss's changing form itself solidifies the idea of irrelevancy of sprites for the plot and themes to be conveyed. It's a very refreshing way to deliver a story, but even that concept wasn't a complete innovation. Probably the biggest inspiration for Space Funeral was 1989 Famicom game Monster Party. It's very surprising that such game would be released considering the time and environment of gaming industry back then. While it wasn't rare for platformers in the 80s to have wacky and silly worlds and plot lines, it was very novel to write a story on almost comical premise and make the world where the game takes place almost completely incoherent. To clue you in, the game starts as Gargoyle Bird lands on Earth and asks baseball player Mark to help him defeat evil monsters that run rampant in his world. And to accomplish this task more efficient, they fuse together and their adventure begins. If the premise for the plot isn't weird enough, the so-called monsters in this game range from umbrella bats to fish heads with legs to literal chairs and people wearing gakuran. The mini-bosses in each round are even more odd and have even less thematic consistency with level design and overall plot. You fight a guitar player in ancient Egypt themed level and a transforming deep-fried snack in sewers themed level. On top of that, each boss has its own lines. They can be humorous, threatening, or something else. One of the mini-bosses just right away announces its death and you don't even have to fight it. The other one asks to watch its dance before you can proceed. As you can see, the nature of the game is quite similar to Space Funeral, but there is one thing that's drastically different, and that is the plot depth. Besides the opening sequence that I mentioned, the story does not develop at all up until the final boss. After defeating which, game ends with a triple plot twist, showing Bert betraying Mark, then Mark waking up and realizing that everything he's gone through was a nightmare, just to bump into Bert in real life once more, who offers him to go again. This is just my opinion, but game seems to be a satire on the state of games that were coming out in that time period, how little attention was usually paid to the story, and how really inconsequential was who were the enemies in the games. All that really mattered is the entertainment that the gameplay brings, and whether you're fighting a dragon to save the princess or a cat in the box to help Bert the gargoyle while playing was really insignificant. I admire the developers of Maker Parody for creativity and audacity to follow through with such unconventional satirical game in the late 80s gaming market. But even though it's very rich to ask an S game to have a complex writing, in all its entirety, Maker Parody just seems to be a parody of its respected genre, and perhaps of some horror movies that were coming out at that time. Besides mostly unique choice of monster sprites, bizarre plot and some jokes, the game is a pretty standard action platformer. Space Funeral, on the other hand, while mainly making fun of mediocre RPG Maker games, still have much more to offer to the player in terms of concepts and themes, and is just a great standalone title outside of RPG Maker genre. In conclusion, I think Space Funeral, while not perfect, especially in terms of gameplay, does something very important for gaming, in particular experimenting with visuals while tying them in with the story and themes, to bring attention to stagnation of the genre. Having one of the main messages of the game about art was also a refreshing thing for 2010, and just generally, the feeling of not knowing what to expect while playing make the game a very unique and significant part of RPG Maker games history. I know some of the things I said are more subjective than the others, so feel free to comment if you agree or disagree with any of my points. Maybe share some of your interpretations of the game. Thank you very much for watching the video. Leave a like if you think I've done a good job at analyzing the game. Subscribe and click the bell to get notified about my next video. See ya!